Everybody wants the jury system. The jury system is the heartbeat of the criminal justice process. If anyone had said a few months ago that this government were going to decimate the jury system, they're ripping the soul out of the criminal justice process without a mandate from the public, frankly, that's just rubbish. And it scares me that that can be the approach. Keir Starmer was only declaring a year or two ago how incredible the jury system is. So was David Lammy.
Lucy Connolly, for example, we saw actually that when needed, they could swing into action and people were in jail within days.
Yes, there is a significant element of two-tier justice. David Lammy needs to go to a prison to look at what it's like to be incarcerated in a cell.
What's gone wrong in our society that this thing that we hold so dear, free speech, has actually turned into a veil, an excuse for intimidation, bullying and violence.
Old women who look Jewish had people coming up to them in masks, shouting in their faces, "How many children have you killed today? How many children have you killed today?" And the police were standing there.
Would you say that that's a failing of the police or of the law or of the government? I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti. Just before we carry on, if you like these conversations as much as I like having them, please remember to like and subscribe. It will help the channel grow and you'll get notifications whenever there is a new interview. Jeremy Dein KC, welcome. Thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me, Jonathan.
Jeremy, you are perhaps one of the best known and most respected criminal barristers in this country. You've spent decades working on the coalface of the justice system. And I'm really pleased that we can have a chance to speak about that justice system and a few other things going on in the UK now. Let's start with jury trials, because that's in the news a lot. And there is this move, apparently, to get rid of jury trials. First off, can you explain to me what the proposition is?
Yeah, Jonathan, so thank you for the welcome and very flattering comments. The current position in the UK, which has been the situation since time began really, is that in relation to any offence which is vaguely serious and essentially attracts what might be classified as a substantial prison sentence, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, upwards to life, is tried by a jury. That's 12 people selected at random, ordinary citizens, determining the innocence or guilt of accused persons. The proposal is that that system should be decimated and that only if a crime attracts a sentence of 3 years or more should it be tried by a jury. That means that a huge number of offences currently tried by juries will no longer be tried by juries, but will be tried by judges only.
And to be clear, that is something that's enshrined in British law since Magna Carta. We're talking, 1215. This is something that was introduced into the British justice system.
That's correct. So it's been there forever. I mean, the jury system is the heart and soul of the criminal justice process. If anyone had said, a few months ago that this government were going to decimate the jury system, people would have been shocked and said, well, how can you, it's like ripping the heart out of a human being. So that's really where we are at the moment.
Is it something that you, as somebody who works in this area, are aware the public wants?
Yes, Jonathan, that's a very good question. It's a very appropriate question. It's what everybody wants. The jury system is the heartbeat of the criminal justice process. It's, prosecutors want it. I'm a diehard defender, but obviously I know many prosecutors, and I respect, prosecutors on the whole, and I've got good friends who are prosecutors. I'm very well acquainted now with the judiciary. Many of the judiciary are my friends, they're my peers, they're my colleagues. Everybody wants the jury system. It doesn't matter what side you are, what role you play in the criminal justice process. With very few exceptions, people respect the jury system, they're confident with the jury system, their consciences tell them that we need a jury system, and that's how it is.
It's basically a keystone, a foundation of our democratic system, as far as I think most lay people see it. The idea that you could be tried by 12 of your peers, and the idea that at some point in many of our lives we will get called up to sit in a jury of 12. And, it's something we've seen in films, in literature, in the news. We know that those 12 people are tasked with a very important role of hearing all the evidence, the arguments made by lawyers like yourself, the guidance of the judge, but then they make the decision. The idea that basically the man on the Clapham omnibus
Exactly.
is the person who says, well, I think on the balance of all this evidence and the explanation of the law, this is what is the answer, guilty, not guilty, etc.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And what the jury system does, above all, it brings the criminal justice process into the community. So it links the process with the community, and it makes people feel that they are part of the criminal justice process, that they are, they have an important role to play. And accused people see the jury as, a safeguard against the establishment. And in my experience, the victims want juries, and victims' families want juries because they feel that they understand their emotions and their claims. So, let me make it clear. I mean, the proposal is not for the jury system to be abolished across the board. It's just for a very significant inroad to the jury system. But, it's a complicated path that has got us here. But it's the wrong decision.
Right.
It's an ill-informed announcement. And it's something that certainly amongst those people who know what they're talking about, what they're thinking, are vociferously against. There's no question about that.
And so, as we said, that dates back to Magna Carta, 1215, and it was the promise that no one should lose liberty without the lawful judgment of his peers and the law of the land. But David Lammy, our Justice Secretary, has said that he wants to modify it because of this backlog. So let's get on to the backlog.
Yeah.
There's something like 80,000 cases that it's projected to reach. And that means that people, well, what does it mean? They are going to be in court for a crime. And then how long does it take before they're actually tried?
Well, first of all, Jonathan, that is right. The backlog is said to be in the region of 75 to 80,000 cases, or it will be very soon. That's point one. Point two is that it follows that criminal trials are being very substantially delayed. Serious cases where accused people are in custody tend now to be tried within a year to 18 months of charge, which is obviously a very long time. That is approximately double what it was maybe 10 years ago.
Serious cases meaning what?
Serious cases, in principle, meaning where the accused person is in custody. So armed robbery, certainly serious sexual offences, very serious drug supply offences, manslaughter, murder, that range of offence.
Nasty tweets?
Nasty tweets, probably not. Where people are on bail, this is quite shocking. Cases, so nasty tweets may fall into that category. It depends on.
Well, I'm thinking of it like Lucy Connolly, for example, and the Southport riots or protests. We saw actually that when needed, they could swing into action and people were in jail within days.
I know, but that's not absolutely. The Prime Minister got involved in all that, didn't he? It was almost like a campaign of retribution. But generally speaking, bail cases are now being listed for anything up to 3 to 4 years hence. So I've got cases now that were due to be tried this year that have been moved over the past few weeks to 2027 and 2028. These are bail cases of assault occasioning actual bodily harm, that kind of offence, which, I've got a man of good character who got into an incident in the street. He's a businessman. His whole life is on hold, his reputation. That case was due to be tried this week. It's now been listed for the middle of 2027. So that's what's happening. But with the backlog, I mean, I know we can get into this if you want. The Justice Secretary is completely wrong that the partial abolition of juries will resolve the backlog. It won't do anything to resolve the backlog. The suggestion is that judges try cases instead of juries. That won't help the backlog. And all he needed to do was to ask judges whether they agreed, which he never did, and they would find that the answer is, Justice Secretary, you're wrong. But instead of doing that, he just made the announcement.
Why would it potentially, in Lammy's mind, speed things up? Is a jury something that slows down the trial?
No. I mean, in answer to your question, Jonathan, why would he say or think that it slows cases up? The answer is we don't know, because he's actually never explained it. And I'm not sure that if he was asked, he could. I think the line of thought, if that's the right word, is that, by having juries, cases just take too long. that the whole mechanics of getting in members of the public, of, explaining cases to them, of giving them time to consider, protracts proceedings. But, the reality is that there may be a slight element of that, but the reality is that it doesn't. The cases won't take that much shorter if judges try cases. But the problem, which he has never addressed and probably hasn't even considered, is that first of all, judges don't want to be jurors. They are lawyers. They don't want that responsibility. Secondly, that if judges try cases, that will be a responsibility alongside their other responsibilities, which will remain in more serious cases overseeing jury trials. So they'll be trying cases on their own and overseeing jury trials. And then they will have to do written reasons, which is a very, very complicated and time-consuming task. So nowadays, for example, when a judge tries a case with a jury, when the jury go out to consider their verdict, the next case starts. Instead, what will happen is that once all the evidence has been called and so on, the judge will need 2 days to write out his judgment. So he won't be able to do anything else.
It might actually slow things down.
It could well slow things down. And that's the view of the judiciary. And I know that because I've spoken to many of the judiciary about it in the build-up to this podcast. And because this week I've spoken to many judges. They just don't think this proposal is justified, and they don't want the responsibility. They don't even think they're qualified to assume that responsibility. But this announcement was made without any proper canvassing at all.
And it wasn't a manifesto pledge. It's not that people voted for Labour to do that.
In my view, that's a very, very important point. This has been done without any advance notice. There was nothing in the manifesto. And, they're ripping the soul out of the criminal justice process without a mandate from the public. And they wouldn't have got that mandate from the public.
Without trying to put too fine a point on it, it is a massive change in Britain's constitutional structure.
Yeah. I mean, I won't go necessarily this far, but I don't know. You may be better qualified to make a judgment on this than I am. But if it had been part of their manifesto, I venture to suggest that a lot of people wouldn't have voted Labour. You did vote Labour.
Let me ask this. Is there a sense also that a jury, by virtue of being 12 people and 12 people from ordinary and varied backgrounds, not, for example, one judge, from a presumably well-educated but comparatively privileged background potentially, may dilute individual biases or political slants? Not that I want to cast aspersions on the judiciary, but they are human beings. So it removes from the judge this potential for his own biases or opinions to be making some of the decision, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's a very, very important point. Judges are judges and jurors are jurors, and for David Lammy to announce that the one will do the job of the other. I mean, what would people think if he suddenly announced that jurors were going to do the judge's job? That's how extreme it is. Judges are exactly what you say. Look, I'm a defender. And that's what I am. I'm also a part-time judge, but I'm speaking, my real job is a defender. I've got great respect for the judiciary in the modern world. I don't want to give the impression that on the whole, the judiciary is biased or partisan or politically orientated. It isn't. It really tries its best to administer justice. But a jury consists of 12 people from all walks of life who come fresh into the process without prior tainting through their involvement with other cases and so on. That's 12 minds from all corners from different corners of society. A judge is a single individual steeped in the process who's been a prosecutor and or a defender and a judge for many years. You can't compare the two. There's no comparison. But what this government are doing is throw them all together.
And in what I said, I also don't mean to cast aspersions on the independence and the professionalism of judges, but I think that the public often has doubts about judges. We've seen important cases where there has been media or public pressure to say, actually, we think this judge or that judge is acting according to their own whims. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily true, but I think that even visually, the idea that 12 people are coming together under the guidance of the judge and given the evidence by the legal teams, it definitely surely has to dilute any potential idea that there could be a bias in the judge just by virtue of it being 12 people rather than one.
I think that's totally right. I think judges are going to be. It's very difficult for judges. A lot of the criticism judges receive is totally unfair. It genuinely is. more often than not, if not always, when they're slaughtered in the media, it's because the media don't have a real understanding of the sentencing guidelines and so on. But, judges are going to have to play to the audience if they're trying cases. And that means that in controversial cases and serious cases, if they are before judges, they're going to be worried about the comeback if they don't reach the verdict that the public expects. There's no... The system is going to be heavily prejudiced by this development if it comes in.
So you mentioned that judges don't want this, and we're mostly agreed that the population of the country probably doesn't want this, and that David Lammy hasn't really explained, or the government, why they think it will have the effect they say it will of shortening the backlog of cases. So do you think there's an ulterior motive? Why are they introducing this? Or do you think there was some expensive consultancy team from McKinsey's who worked out there's a saving? What's the real reason?
Well, the background to this is the Leveson report, which was commissioned by this government to report on resolution of the backlog, which Brian Leveson, very well respected former Lord Justice of Appeal, presided over. But so he did recommend changes in the system, but his recommendation was far less far-reaching than the government. So they've actually gone way beyond that.
What did he want?
He recommended that in a much smaller number of cases would be tried by a judge and 2 magistrates, but without going into the detail, in a much smaller quota of cases than this government now propose. Their recommendation goes much further and proposes that there should be no magistrates, no community element, and it should be judges alone. In more direct answer to your question, I think the problem is that this government are facing a backlog of 80,000 cases. They have to be seen to do something to address that problem. And the easiest way of doing it is to abolish jury trial to a significant degree, because the alternative would be actually to get down to some very hard work, looking at the structure of trials, looking at certain legal provisions, the admissibility of evidence, how cases are managed, how they can be shortened, and just really getting into the detail of criminal trials. Much easier is what they've done, which is just to say, well, we get rid of juries. There's been no high-flying, consultancy. We know that. There's been no consultancy. They've been asked many, many times, who has advised you on this? There's been no answer to that question. I think what they've done is they've taken the easy option. I suspect they regret it now. I don't think they realised what the comeback would be on this, because there's huge opposition in the Labour Party, as well as obviously in other parties and across the country. I don't think they realised how much opposition there would be to. I think they just thought, oh, well, people are not too worried about the criminal justice process. This will just go through.
Which is not something I think anyone would ever say about the population if they were in touch with people. Are, of course,
no, I know,
interested in the criminal justice system,
but it just hasn't been thought through.
Yes,
it just hasn't been.
And it seems, would you agree that from a communications perspective, it's a terrible policy because people do care deeply? But it seems like in this case, it's not just that it would be an unpopular move in the media and among the people of the nation, but it also, you're saying that actually within the criminal justice system, it's respected and valued by those who actually work it every day. So it both has the impression of being a bad move and it actually is a bad move.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Look, it needs to be clear that the proposal is that cases of 3 years or more will generally retain the entitlement for trial by jury. So a significant quota of cases will still be tried by juries, but offences of up to 3 years imprisonment, across the board, can be very serious: robbery, domestic burglary, sexual offences, drugs offences. So it's a very large quota.
Spending up to 3 years in prison is no small thing.
For everybody, but especially for a lot of people who've never been wrapped up in the process before. Maybe there's a row in a pub, there's an assault, or, suggested sexual crimes. And so, what has to be appreciated is that 1 minute in custody is a long time. And if you are innocent and you are sentenced to prison wrongly, 1 second in custody is a second too long. So just to say, take this arbitrary cutoff point of up to 3 years and say, oh, it's fine. If it's less than 3, it's not too bad. It's not too bad, it's manageable. It's just complete, it's beyond my comprehension. I mean, David Lammy needs to go to a prison to look at what it's like to be incarcerated in a cell and to ask himself, is it fair to say that offences which do not carry a sentence of 3 years or more are not that serious, so we don't need to... frankly, that's just rubbish. And it scares me that that can be the approach.
And this isn't the only change that is proposed either. Historically, a defendant convicted in a magistrate's court could automatically appeal to the Crown Court. And after the Levinson, after the Levinson review, this is also something that they're planning to change. Is that right?
Again, you've touched on a really important point, one that I feel very strongly about. That is right. So we come to the question of magistrates' courts. So the proposal that we've been discussing encompasses the proposition that the magistrates' court will have much greater sentencing powers of perhaps 2 years or more.
For those who don't know, what is the difference between a magistrate and a judge?
Well, a very significant quota of criminal cases are tried in the magistrates' court, the less serious offences. On the whole, magistrates are laypersons guided by a legal advisor, although there is a quota of legally qualified magistrate.
So I could become a magistrate with the right training, even though I have no legal degree, no legal practice in my history.
Correct. You would become, if you wanted to, I'm sure you could. So that's the magistrates' court. Unfortunately, the magistrates' court does not have a great reputation in the criminal justice community when it comes to administering justice. The conviction rate is very high, and although I'm sure they do their best, that ever since I began in my career, there's been a sense of dissatisfaction. It's a bit of a roller coaster justice type environment. Therefore, the proposal that a person convicted in the magistrates' court, even though their sentencing powers are now to be increased to around 2 years, yet to be determined, has no right of appeal, is again shocking. Because it basically means that if you are convicted in the magistrates' court, there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to accept it. So not only is there a suggested very significant inroad to the jury process, but alongside that, the right to appeal in the magistrates' court is being apparently and provisionally confiscated. These are extraordinarily far-reaching proposals, and the public need to understand, although they have a sense of it, that they need to understand, I don't mean to sound arrogant about it, that the face of the criminal justice process is being eroded, as you said, and it's a very crucial point in my view, without manifesto pledge and without any prior indication before this government came to power. That's not acceptable. In my view, that's not acceptable, and it shouldn't happen.
As you said, it goes much further than Levinson suggested in the report, so it doesn't even have that as a sort of grounding of authority or a reason. Let me ask more broadly.
If I could just say this, Jonathan, I was very heavily involved with the Criminal Bar Association at the time of the Levinson report. I, in fact, co-chaired the Criminal Bar Association's response to Levinson, and we had a long meeting with Lord Justice Levinson. And Lord Justice Levinson is an extraordinarily experienced individual, and his proposals were bona fides and genuine. But as to the need for some much less far-reaching reform, we strongly disagreed. But this government have gone so much further than Levinson, and how they could do that, they commission his report, he makes his proposals, and then they just override them and do their own thing. I mean, how does that happen?
Who invented the idea of jury trials?
One of the kings did it, but I can't remember.
But it's British. That's my question.
I'm not sure it is British, actually.
Okay.
I think it may be a Scandinavian. I can't remember. I've actually looked this up, but I don't remember.
No, I'm curious.
I know.
I have this vision of Magna Carta being this.
I think it may have come from somewhere else, but I can't remember. I did look it up.
Fair enough. Well, the reason I ask is, there must be other countries who've dealt with similar problems. There are countries that rely on jury trial and countries that have phased it out. I believe Germany doesn't have as much jury trial, if any, compared to, I think in the 70s, they changed things. Are we maybe looking to other countries who have done something similar?
First of all, a lot of other countries have a completely different criminal justice process where they've just never had juries. They have an inquisitorial system, like an investigative system, where judges and other associated figures look into the allegation. So they're completely different systems altogether. Just totally different systems. And we've always taken the view that our system is much, much better quality than theirs. That's point one. Point two is that in jurisdictions like Canada, where they do much more commonly have judge in systems like that in Canada and New Zealand, where they have judge-only trials much more prominently, again, the system is fundamentally different. So David Lammy is pointing to Canada, like he went to Canada recently, he came back and reported what happens in Canada, and he's now been accused by leading academics of getting it all wrong. The bottom line is that in jurisdictions like Canada, accused persons have the right to choose between judge and jury trials. So when it's said that in Canada, judge-only trials are much more common, that may be correct, but that's because A, the system is very different, B, the culture is very different, and C, accused persons have the right to choose. That is very different to the right being taken away, which is what's proposed in this country. And you can't compare other jurisdictions because they're just not the same. And we've always boasted about the quality of our criminal justice system. Keir Starmer was only declaring a year or two ago how incredible the jury system is. So was David Lammy. And it is. So looking at other jurisdictions and certainly not looking at them properly and profoundly is not, it doesn't help. It doesn't help. Sound bites don't help. They just further exacerbate the problem.
Is David Lammy widely respected in legal circles as Justice Secretary?
I think that as Justice Secretary, one of the first things he did was to make this proposal about juries. That proposal is heavily disrespected, and I'm not sure people can see beyond that at the moment. So I don't think he's been Justice Secretary long enough for people to make an assessment beyond this proposal. But the substance of this proposal and the way it was announced and the lack of ostensible evidence and research, if I can put it this way, has very seriously troubled the criminal justice community, whether they be judges, whether they be prosecutors, whether they be defenders. That's how it is, I'm afraid. He may yet prove himself to be one of the greatest justice secretaries. But, Jonathan, if I could just make this point, he said at one point a few weeks ago, well, juries are just tradition. He said we can't go on, resting our sort of beliefs in tradition. Like tradition, he's the Lord Chancellor. Like if someone said to him, excuse me, Mr. Lammy, but the Lord Chancellor is a bit of an outdated concept. Should we get rid of it? How would he feel? Like who needs a Lord Chancellor? What does it actually mean in the modern world? So this kind of, we were all very, very shocked when he said juries are just tradition, because that is such an insulting and empty declaration.
Wigs in court are maybe a tradition. Juries...
Get rid of wigs.
Exactly. Jury is a little bit more fundamental to justice and how it's applied. Moving on a little bit, you're somebody that spent decades between the power of the state and the law and the individual and the effect it has on their life. And that's really an interesting perspective. When we talk about people like Lucy Connolly and other cases which were politically fast-tracked through the courts, there is this perception among some people in Britain and further afield that there is two-tier justice going on in the UK. So on the broadest level, do you think there is any validity in that claim?
I think there's validity in the claim that in the year 2025, 2026, there is a significant element of two-tier approach to justice. So like if you take the Lucy Connolly scenario and the riots that took place, I found it truly, shocking that the Prime Minister would get involved and, suddenly you'd hear this voice from 10 Downing Street calling for, justice and for, so, that's unheard of. And the way those offences were dealt with and the fast tracking and the sending of people to prison within hours and the midnight courts. Yes, I think that was very, very, was unacceptable, and I'm trying to think of a word other than shocking, but unsettling. I think the police have real problems these days with a lot of, certainly in the world of protests, they're really finding it very difficult to meet the challenge of distinguishing between what may be regarded as criminal conspiracies to intimidate and protest. I don't think they understand the law. I don't think they're properly trained. So when, for example, Jewish people, and I am Jewish and very proudly Jewish, but I've also defended people from across the spectrum of life. But when Jewish people are intimidated by by what are unquestionably, statements that cause alarm and distress, which should be dealt with as public order offences and told, well, there's nothing wrong with that because, people can say what they like, free speech. I mean, this is happening all over the country at the moment and it needs to stop. And so, sorry about the long-winded answer. Yes, there is a significant element of two-tier justice. Yeah.
So you're someone with a front row seat to how these legal considerations, sentencing, all these things actually affect people's lives. So you've touched on it a few times in what you've said so far, but it's worth mentioning, you defend people who are accused of some of the worst crimes, and you protect their right to a fair trial and justice. That could be murder, it could be rape, it could be extreme violence. Those people are sometimes unfairly accused. And all the way down, the whole principle of justice is that there's an accusation, there is evidence. It starts really with the police. And you're saying that the police in some of these cases are not qualified to understand the law and to apply it at that level. And therefore, by the time it gets up to the court, it's almost a failure already.
Well, first of all, I would say that largely the criminal justice process in this country does a good job and does its best to address the issues and strives to reach a just outcome. So the thing is, Jonathan, in that level of case, murder, I mean, my speciality for the last 20 years, 25 years has been homicide. So I've done many, many homicide cases. The police do their best to investigate them. They're very thoroughly investigated. The courts do their best to reach the right verdict. And, the wheels of justice turn. The much more troubling feature of our process these days is on the streets, public order crime. Public order crime is a real problem because, in my view, what has happened is that there's been a real confusion between the right to free speech and the prohibition of criminal activity, criminal intimidation, threats.
Public order in layman's terms, it's, when there's a protest, people on the street, whether they get into a fight, that sort of thing is what you're addressing here.
It's what I'm addressing, but it's where members of the public are insulted and threatened and where abusive and intimidatory language is used, which scares and frightens people. And where it's said, well, there's nothing we can do about that because that's free speech.
So there have been many cases, as you've alluded to, where over the last couple of years in particular, Jewish people have felt that there are mobs outside places, whether it's like JW3 in London, the Jewish Community Centre, the Cultural Centre, or whether it's been Israeli-run businesses like Miznon in Notting Hill has been in the news a lot recently, where literally a group, a mob, a protest, whatever one wants to call them, arrives. They chant very aggressive phrases and chants, whether it is in English, baby killers, genocide, from the river to the sea, or sometimes even chants in Arabic, Khaybar Khaybar ya Yahud, that Jews should remember the Battle of Khaybar, when Muhammad and his army slaughtered them and forcibly married the wife of their leader, Sophia. Now, these things seem to many Jewish people, I too am Jewish, I speak to a lot of people about these incidents as very, very clearly and obviously intended to be intimidatory, very scary, to the extent that if one doesn't feel scared for one's own personal safety in that moment, one does go home and think very clearly and carefully about one's future and one's children's future in this country. And I would say that I agree with you that the police do not inspire those people with those fears with a sense of safety and security. Would you say that that's a failing of the police or of the law or of the government?
I think it's a failing of all three. I think you put it very well, and I've thought about it a lot, and I've been very heavily involved in trying to address it. The first thing I'd say is, there was an alleged protest outside the JW3 about a year ago. The JW3 is Jewish Community Centre in North London, where people go to enjoy and to celebrate their Jewish identities, and where many non-Jews go to sharing that experience.
It's a cultural centre.
It's a cultural centre, but it's not a cultural centre which prohibits the attendance of non-Jews. And I've been there when many Muslims have been there, and they've just enjoyed.
Yeah, it's a very welcoming and open place, for sure.
Exactly, as other religious institutions are. But there was this gathering outside the JW3, which I've spent many hours looking at the footage of, which labeled itself a protest, which in my view was a totally, unacceptable criminal conspiracy, where old women who weren't even going into the JW3 but looked Jewish had people coming up to them in masks, shouting in their faces. And when I say shouting, I mean shouting, "How many children have you killed today? How many children have you killed today?" And the police were standing there, and you could see these people reeling back from what was taking place. And when members of the public were saying, "What are you going to do about that?" they would say, "Well, we can't do anything about it. They're just giving their opinion." And nobody was charged with any offence outside that on that occasion. And it's a replication of what's happened across the country over the last couple of years. So, sorry to just come back to your question. Who is it a failing of? It's a government failing, because the government have done, have dramatically failed, in my view, to stamp this out. And especially in London, where the mayor of London and the people around him have done nothing to stamp it out, and making statements about Israel and saying, well, it's difficult for people because of what's happening in Israel, so they feel, strongly about it, just exacerbates the issue. Is it a failing of the law? Yes, it is. The law should be tightened up and made much clearer in prohibiting this type of behavior. And is it a failing of the police? Yes, it is. But in a sense, you can understand that, because the problem is that these problems from all over the world have been transported to the streets of London. And to train police officers to understand what may be, within the realms of the law or outside the realms of the law is difficult. So they just stand there looking bewildered, and really what they want to do is just get their shifts over, go and have a bath and recover from what is undoubtedly a difficult situation. But in the end, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of victims of these criminal intimidatory conspiracies, and that's what they are. They're not genuine freedom of speech. They're criminal intimidatory conspiracies, and it needs to be stopped even now.
And what do you think the effect is on the victims of those protests?
The victims, the effect is, it makes people feel, and especially, I'm targeting the impact on Jewish people, it makes them feel unprotected, it makes them feel insecure, and it has come to the point where it makes them feel that they prefer not to go out on a Saturday or Sunday, that they're better stay at home or not go to certain parts of the city of London, especially in the country, because they're worried about what might happen. And the knock-on effect is that it's making a lot of Jewish people feel unsettled in this country. But, what needs to be appreciated is that the Jewish community have made an incredible contribution to the lifeblood of United Kingdom, honest and hardworking and committed. And, we deserve maximum protection, and we're not getting that protection. It needed the slaughter. It needed the slaughter of Jewish people in Australia for the police in this country to say that calling for global jihad had to stop. We've been calling for that for the last, few years. It needed blood on the beaches of Australia for the police in this country to say, well, we think people shouldn't really say that anymore. That's mind-blowing, isn't it?
And what's extraordinary is that it's not a new idea. Jewish people and non-Jewish people had been telling them exactly that for over 2 years.
Exactly.
And quite apart from that, it also needed the deaths at the Heaton Park Synagogue in Manchester.
Exactly, yeah.
There is, in my mind, it's hard perhaps to say it from a legal perspective, but there is a very clear line to be drawn between those mobs outside, say, JW3 or Miznon restaurant, and the killing of people at prayer on Yom Kippur in a synagogue. It's not to say that one definitely causes the other.
No.
But a climate is created.
A climate, yeah. Look, I just want to make it clear, having defended in the court since 1982, I totally respect the right to protest. The right to protest is so important. But it's just been used over the last couple of years as a falsity for what's been taking place. I mean, I used to spend a lot of my time when I was younger, especially as a student, at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. I was very pro-Israel at a time when the world saw Israel very differently. And I used to go on a soapbox and speak about, those issues. And next to me and my friends, my colleagues, was the Palestine Liberation Organization soapbox. And they had very, very strong views about what was taking place and issues and geographical complexities. But, you could go there and you genuinely felt on both sides, on all sides, that you were, unleashing your right to protest. And then at the end of the day, we'd have a chat together. Sometimes we'd even go for a coffee together when we talk about these issues. That's what the right to protest is all about. It was a glorious opportunity to, to release your emotions and to make people understand how you felt on all sides. And no one ever felt intimidated. No one felt scared. You look forward to a Sunday. You'd feel that that was your chance to share in, with people on your views. Now, I've been to the Speaker's Corner over the last year or two, and I've been genuinely scared to go back. You go there and you feel that you're going to be killed. And that's not an understatement. If you express your views, you feel you might be seriously injured or killed. That's how it's changed.
And it's changed drastically. And again, it's more than a tradition, to use a Lambism. Speaker's Corner has this, it's famous internationally.
Yeah.
I think since the 1800s, it was a place where you could go and express free speech, whatever your opinions, and it attracted people like George Orwell and Karl Marx.
Precisely.
It was enshrined in law, I think, in the late 1800s as a place where this could happen. So the idea that it has changed, and it really has. I don't know if you know Joseph Cohen, who makes a lot of content online as well. He's literally left this country and moved to Israel, and gave an interview recently about how he used to go to Speaker's Corners regularly.
Right. I wasn't aware of that.
Exactly as you said, he was threatened physically so many times there that he was afraid for his life and his family's lives. What does it say to you as somebody? It's interesting to hear that you used to go to Speaker's Corner.
For 2 or 3 years, that was my favorite thing to do.
It points to me to a massive shift in our society more broadly. That was a time when free speech actually meant something important. You could go and share your views. The person on the soapbox next to you could share completely opposite views, and you could have a discussion and a debate. You could disagree, and you could go, as you said, for a coffee afterwards. That definitely isn't happening anymore. Definitely not happening in Speaker's Corner, but it's not really happening on television. It's not happening on YouTube. You watch Piers Morgan Uncensored.
Yeah.
And again, under this banner of free speech, what you actually see are people who want to rip each other to shreds. And on the streets, you see people who will rip each other to shreds. What's gone wrong in our society that this thing that we hold so dear, you and I both, free speech, has actually turned into a veil, an excuse for intimidation, bullying, and violence?
I mean, that is such a profound question. What's gone wrong in our society? I think that the concept of hate has just taken over, and I'm not sure that the authorities, know how to or have the, skills to deal with it. I think hate has just been allowed to creep into everyday life. I can speak predominantly about this country. Can't really speak for other countries. All I can say is, and I know it has its own problems. Let me make that clear. But I spend significant periods of time in Hong Kong, where I'm a visiting professor, and when I want to just stress, I totally take on board, that there is this, overwhelming element of oppression in the way that the Chinese government deal with issues in Hong Kong. That is an issue which cannot be ignored, which is at the forefront without doubt. But the fact is, when I'm in Hong Kong, on a day-to-day basis, the relief that I feel at the absence of this atmosphere of hate and vitriol in this country is so stark. It's just so stark. And as a Jew, to be able to walk the streets and not feel that someone might insult me or look at my nose, or that I might see, something said or hear something said that is blatantly anti-Semitism. So we've allowed in this country, in my view, the element of hate to creep in. I think that this government has not done anything like enough to stamp it out. I think there is a fundamental confusion between anti-Israel feeling and anti-Semitism. I think that a lot of statements have been made by this government about Israel, the rhetoric, the extreme statements, and by, the powers that lead London have encouraged that element of hate. And I just think that in the end, the concept of hate has been allowed to become a prominent feature of day-to-day life in this country. And that's how I feel. I may be wrong. I may be wrong about that, but that's how I feel.
But I suppose what people would say to disagree with you is, well, hate is a perfectly valid emotion or opinion for them to express freely under that banner of free speech. If they are hateful of an idea, they should be allowed to go and say so in a hateful but peaceful way.
Well,
Where do you draw this line?
Well, firstly, Jonathan, I think one of the problems with hate in this country is that it's fueled by ignorance. So for me, it's actually not acceptable, even under the umbrella of free speech, to go around preaching hate when you don't actually know what you're talking about. A huge quantity of what's said about the problem, the extraordinarily troubling problem in the Middle East is fueled by ignorance. People don't actually understand the history, the claims, and so on. So I think, I don't actually think that hate largely is acceptable because it's fueled by ignorance. Where you draw the line, and the line has not been drawn anywhere nearly clearly enough, even having said that, is between the expression of free speech and criminal conduct. Criminal conduct should begin. The line should start where others feel threatened, intimidated, scared by what is being said. That's where the line needs to be drawn. That's not free speech. That is criminal conduct. And nowhere nearly enough has been done to pinpoint where that line should begin over the past few years. It's just been ignored. It's been completely ignored. It's probably too great a problem. The government are probably worried about offending certain sections of society, and so it's just been left.
Well, I think you've touched on something very important there, which is I'm not even sure it's been ignored, or I think it's worse than that, because I think often when groups of people, in this case we're talking about Jews, but it's not always Jews, say collectively, in a general sense, predominantly, we feel intimidated. It's dismissed, and they're told something worse than that, which is, well, actually, you're only saying that for a nefarious reason.
Yeah.
You're saying that because you wish to silence somebody else's right to criticize something about the Middle East or about Israel. And you may not want to hear what those people say about the Middle East and Israel, but that's not why you feel threatened and intimidated for your own personal safety. So to me, that seems to be a line that's very worth exploring. It may be hard to draw precisely, but as you say, they're very far over the wrong side.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think what the authorities have been doing far too often, and Sadiq Khan has made various speeches along these lines, which I find, which make my blood boil, and sorry to use such a crude expression, is that where he has made statements, or certainly one particular speech that he made, about the rise in anti-Semitism, where he has uttered words to the effect it's not acceptable, and then included in that speech reference to Benjamin Netanyahu and what's happened in Israel, and effectively empathized with the hostility that is generated towards Jews, whilst claiming that he disapproves of it, is that he's confused these issues, and he's allowed anti-Israel feelings to become a justification for the intimidation of rabbis and elderly Jews and younger Jews who wear kippahs on the streets. What kind of leadership is that? What kind of example does that set? And, then people get knighthoods in return for. And I wrote to the Mayor of London about this in very strong terms after a particular speech that he made. 3 months later, I got a response from one of his staff, not from him, effectively saying, well, it's all a bit difficult, but the Mayor of London is completely against anti-Semitism. So as a Jew, leave aside what I am, a barrister or whatever I may be, as a Jew, how does that leave me feeling?
It seems to me that there's more than just a reluctance to deal with it, because it's prickly. There seems, and I think I'm not alone in feeling this, that there is a sort of quiet nod to say, actually, they agree. And that's the problem, because when you speak out against anti-Semitism, but in the same speech you discuss negative views of the Prime Minister of Israel, that might be a valid criticism of the Prime Minister of Israel, but it certainly gives succor to that whole attack on Jewish people, because you've joined them together, as the protesters try to do. So this is all quite bleak in terms of how many of us feel in the UK. And you're a figure of the establishment, I guess one could say. You don't come from a background of that, but that is what you have worked towards. Not an atypical story for Jewish people in this country, not an atypical story for many minority or even immigrant groups. But how do you feel now looking ahead? I know so many Jewish people who are looking at society around us in Britain, British Jews. I myself, born here, feel very British, have lived here all my life. And I would be lying if I said I didn't frequently think about whether I will live here for the rest of my life, whether this is a safe place or a smart place for us to raise children, whether those children and their children will have as comfortable a future in Britain as the ones we felt we had or hoped to have in our lifetimes. Is it time for a plan B? Is it time for Jewish people and non-Jewish Brits to look at this and say, drastic change is needed, or what?
Well, I think that time has come. I think many Jewish people are questioning what future Jewish people have in this country. First thing I'd like to say on that is just so sad because, we haven't done anything wrong. We haven't been violent. We haven't been intimidatory. We haven't assembled as mobs on the streets of London. We haven't, blown up people on tube trains. And I'm not, itemizing any particular group who has, but we've just led our lives.
To be fair, I think you are.
Well, look, all I would say is that if I can just come back to the position in relation to the Jewish community, my overwhelming view is that we have been incredibly good for this country. And we've done so much to contribute to Jewish society. And now, when we are in trouble unfairly, we're not being assisted and we're not being protected. What do Jewish people do? Well, there are a lot of people, let's be clear, there are a lot of Jewish people who don't want to go and live in Israel because they don't actually support what the Israeli government are doing. I was speaking to one only another night, a cousin of mine who lived in Israel until recently for 20 years and has left Israel because they are so vociferously against the policies of the Israeli government and disgusted by what happened in Gaza. I'm not expressing a view on that. That's not what we're talking about, but that's what they did. So the perception that we can all uproot ourselves and go and live in Israel is not straightforward. What is going to happen? I don't know what's going to happen. All I can say is that at the moment it is very bleak. This government, have not helped us. They have not helped us, and I can't see what evidences there is that they're going to help us in a meaningful way. The law needs to change. We need to be much more heavily protected. There need to be much clearer statements and action that the Jewish community will be protected. I don't know what the future holds. I'm not qualified to say. I'm just profoundly disappointed and actually quite disgusted at how we've been left to feel that somehow we are in the wrong and we deserve the treatment that we're getting. That's just completely, as a defense counsel, my instinct is to defend, and I'm helpless, but my overwhelming instinct is that we just need to shout out, scream out the unfairness of what's taking place. On a more practical level, what can happen, what should be done, I just don't know at the moment. It's all a bit hopeless.
And I just want to touch on some specifics, because what you say is it's sad when we have these sorts of conversations. It makes me immensely sad as a Brit.
Yeah.
Never mind as a Jew, as a British person. It's a tragedy and a failing for this country. But we're not exaggerating or imagining, are we? There are so many examples now. We've mentioned the JW3 mob. We've mentioned really the weekly or bi-weekly protests that went on for nearly 2 years and made people afraid to go out in central London, that caused Holocaust memorials in Hyde Park to have to be covered up during the protests in case they were damaged. We've seen the protests outside an Israeli restaurant. We've seen what happened with the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. I mean, let's just talk about that a little bit, because what I'm getting at with all this is it's got to the point where I think for many people, many regular Brits and Jewish Brits, it feels a bit like a deliberate, joined-up effort rather than a series of unfortunate failings. When you hear that the police have acted the way they have over the Aston Villa Park stuff, and then covered it up repeatedly, then you start to feel like it's a conspiracy against certain people in the country, or at least that they not only don't care, but they're an active part in what is making life worse for Jews.
Yeah, I don't know whether with the Maccabi Tel Aviv Aston Villa situation, this very day, it's emerging even more that statements were publicly made by the leadership of the West Midland Police were misleading, and that essentially the accusation that the reasons given for banning Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters were unfounded. And what's emerging is that there was information before the police that, Islamist groups were going to attack them, that they were armed, that the chief constable of the West Midlands Police has close links with the Islamic community and so on. So, I don't know whether there's any deliberate conspiracy to prejudice or harm the Jewish community. I think society is just very, very complicated these days. Maybe the West Midlands Police were genuinely seeking to avoid trouble, but what they did in pursuit of that was to pretend that it was the Jewish fans from Israel that were going to cause trouble, when they knew, it seems, yet to be confirmed, that it was in fact, opposition to their attendance that was the real threat. That's truly disgraceful. And the people that did that, however smartly dressed they are and however squeaky clean their uniforms, should not only resign or be sacked, but consideration should be given to whether any criminal offence has been committed in that respect. That's how serious it is. Let's wait and see what actually happens.
Again, to me, it feels like the opposite of the role of policing. Yes, there is an element, and I feel like that's something that many people are saying now, which is the police are often, it appears they are often trying to keep the peace.
Yeah.
But the way in which they keep the peace is not necessarily by fair and equal application of the law. So if the way you avoid a fight is by caving to those who are intimidating and threatening, you've not upheld the law.
But that's what's happening across the country. That's what's happening. You can understand it in a way that the police just want a quiet life. They just can't manage it all.
But isn't the whole part of the social contract that we have with the judiciary and the executive and the police that the state has a monopoly on violence? And if people threaten violence on other people, it is those who threaten the violence or carry it out who are breaking the law, and it is the state which has the right to stop them.
I think there's a very significant element here of David Baddiel's Jews Don't Count. There's just this feeling, which prevails, which is that the Jewish community can kind of look after themselves. They're all middle class, they're doctors, they're lawyers, they're journalists, there's just this overwhelming feeling, certainly that I have, that it doesn't really matter what happens, if it's Jews, that they kind of just survive. And, as I've said, I just don't think the police can manage the complication, the volume of and associated complications that go with the behavior of thousands and thousands of people in this country. In the old days, the law was clear. If you committed murder, you go to court, you get convicted. If you commit rape, you get prosecuted, you get convicted or acquitted. If you supply drugs, same applies. But so much is happening, which is complicated by politics and, issues coming from other parts of the world. I just don't think the police are able to manage, so that they'll take the easy option, and that's what's happening.
And it's worse than that. It's not just Jews, I think, who are feeling overlooked. I think there are plenty of non-Jewish Britons who feel that in a variety of other areas, whether it's shoplifting or petty crime or break-ins or bike thefts or phone thefts, the police and the law does not protect them. I know that the local Tesco at the end of our road has regular, almost daily shoplifting.
Yeah.
And the police have literally told them they're not going to attend.
No, well, they can't. They don't have the resources. I just want to make it clear that on a day-to-day level, I still believe, after 42 years, that the criminal justice process does do its best to protect the British public in this country. I don't want to be perceived as launching a stinging attack on those who work very hard to do that. And definitely, prosecuting services, the defence element, the judges, are so honest and so hardworking and so committed to behaving, acting in the interests of the public. And I'm sure that most police officers are as well. But I just think society has become, polluted by hate and by, issues that I just don't think the police can manage. I think things have got out of control. The government have got other problems. They can't cope. And then you've also got people with strong views about the Middle East problem in the government and in authority that mean that hidden messages are sent out that give support, unintentionally perhaps, to what goes on the streets. And so it is that we have a very, very difficult situation confronting us.
The word you didn't use there, though, that I want to try and push on is fear. Isn't it the case that the police the criminal justice system at large, the politicians are afraid of challenging some of these, let's call them antisocial tendencies or behaviors, because of what it might do if they challenge them.
Yeah, I think that is right. I think there is a strong element of fear. I mean, I don't know what happened. We'll find out when the report eventually comes on the West Midlands police. But there's a clear suggestion that the Maccabi, things were covered up. That the prospect of the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans being attacked was covered up because the leadership of the West Midlands police didn't want those who were planning to do that to know that they knew and to react against. So
I suppose this is my point, though, that there is someone they're afraid of. If there is a group that threatens violence against Jews or Israeli visiting fans, it seems to me as a non-legal professional and as a non-police officer fairly obvious who you should go and arrest.
I know, but they didn't do it. So
right.
We'll find out in the report why that didn't happen.
And if there have been decades of people in an organized crime way raping and trafficking children for sex, it seems to me that there is an obvious mode of action. But when you speak even to police officers who did early on blow the whistle, they were told to shut up and never mention it again, out of, I presume, institutional fear. The fear here is of cracking down on a form of extremist Islamism or a form of extreme Islamic inspired crime that has increased in this country with a growing wave of immigration from certain parts of the world. I think, these days, it's less controversial to say that out loud than it might have been because of the disaster we've all witnessed. And that is now daily affecting Jewish people in Britain as well as general Brits. What are we waiting for before we actually fix this? Are we waiting for another Bondi explosion, another Bondi Beach, another Manchester Arena, another Bees office to be burned down, another David Amos?
Yeah, we are. We are. That's what we're waiting for, because we've seen with Bondi Beach that, there's a suggestion that the law will change in terms of certain statements being stamped out. But, we as the Jewish community and you, as a leading figure have been saying for a long time now, there are going to be killings, there are going to be murders, there's going to be an attack. And yes, I think that's what we're waiting for. What happens once that happens, I do not know. I've got no idea, because it may be that the problem we've identified, which is this reluctance to address Islamic extremism, will survive any such attack. And there'll be excuses and contextualization and, things won't change. I don't know. I'm not sure how things could change. I'm not sure how things will change.
Which is distressing to hear, because you're somebody that understands the technicalities of law in terms of criminal.
Well, what do you do? What do you do?
Here's a question then, because you mentioned Hong Kong and China.
Yeah.
And I've heard the same from people I know in the Emirates and in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And we've just heard now this shocking, extraordinary story that the United Arab Emirates have discouraging their own students from coming to study in UK universities. They used to sponsor them to do so, but because they know that those students are more likely to be radicalized in extremist Islam in the UK than they are in the UAE. Now, I realize that these places we've mentioned that are cracking down on this extremism are authoritarian regimes, and I do not wish to live in a system like that. As you said, with communist China, the same is true of other non-democracies. But one feature of those styles of government is that they know how to deal with extremists and how to crack down on it. And the problem, it seems to me, and I want to hear what you have to think about this from a legal perspective, we are now at the mercy of a group of people, both migrants and born here, sometimes born to migrants, sometimes not, who have understood this weakness in our society. This weakness is the freedom you enjoyed at Speaker's Corner. This weakness is our freedom of expression, our freedom of disagreement, even our freedom to hate each other. And they have used it to maximum effect to intimidate and threaten and sometimes apply violence to us, regular British people, to minorities like Jews and plenty of others. And because of our respect for those values of democracy and freedom and being good, nice people, we're not going to crack down on it as they have done in those authoritarian regimes. So where do you see the role of what you do, of the law, in helping to deal, you've complained about what happened outside
Yeah.
JW3.
Yeah.
How are we going to fix it?
There's a further problem, Jonathan, which I haven't yet touched upon, which is a really, really serious problem. And that is that, that when it comes to the Middle East, what I'll call the Middle East problem, when it comes to violence, intimidation, threats being imported onto the streets of London, one of the problems is that there are a lot of people wrapped up in the criminal justice process who have very strong views about Palestine, very supportive of Palestine. And I'm not evaluating that, but the will for the law to be changed, the will for the JW3 type scenario to be stamped out is not universal. There's a lack of impetus because a lot of people within the system, whether they're defenders, whether they're judges, whether they're prosecutors, don't have that will because they also confuse what's happened, what is Israel's conduct with anti-Semitism. So, I just think it's very, very difficult. I find it, as someone who's traded in identifying problems and addressing them, I actually don't really have a vision of how things are going to get better in this country at this very moment in time. But what I do want to say, and again, you've touched upon an issue that I feel very strongly about, is how have we allowed in the universities of this country, like when I think about my teaching in Hong Kong, this is 100 trillion billion miles away from what would be permitted there. How have we allowed students to be in classes across this country and for people to walk in with flags and be masked and scream and shout and intimidate and then just moved on?
To intimidate their professors, even.
Well, to intimidate their professors, or in some cases, their professors intimidating some of their own students. How have we allowed that to happen? How do you resolve that? I can't resolve that. If we've got to the point where that is permissible, then frankly, I just don't know where we go from there.
It's not really a question of the law. It's not a legal issue. It's a cultural issue, isn't it?
It's a cultural issue. It's a society issue. I was heavily involved at St Andrews University, where the rector of St Andrews University had sent out emails condemning, the state of Israel and, accusing Israel of genocide and effectively sending out tweets and messages which made the Jewish population of St Andrews University feel totally isolated. And it took 18 months for the university to take action, which they did in the end. And then on appeal, that person was reinstated. I mean, kind of that's what's going on in this country at the moment. And, I think we're all tired of it. We're all exhausted by it. We're shocked by it. We're exasperated by it. And I'm actually embarrassed as an experienced lawyer that I can't come up with, effective recommendations or solutions, because I just think these problems are so endemic, so widespread, so appalling that, it takes people far more qualified than me in addressing these kind of problems to say how they should be dealt with. That's how I feel about it.
That's the problem. I think our politicians don't know what to do. Our practitioners of the law don't know what to do. Our police don't know what to do.
No.
But that means our citizens also don't know what to do. And more of them, I think, I hear constantly talk of boiling points and civil war and violence, which is equally terrifying as a prospect. Do you think that's where we're heading, towards some kind of civil war?
I think there's a possibility of that, definitely. I do think there's a possibility of that. The sad thing is that if, say, for example, the Jewish community rose up and turned to funding, which they would never do because it's not within our DNA, we'd be punished for it and we'd be vilified for it and we'd be incarcerated for it. And all we'd be doing would be fighting back about what's being done to us. That's the frightening thing. If I as a Jew was to react against a person who's screaming in an old lady's face, how many children have you killed today, and punch that person, I'd be arrested for assault. My career would be over. So are we heading for civil war? I mean, I think there's certainly a serious risk that we're heading for some kind of societal disruption out of people's frustration and anger at what's being allowed to happen, because hate is being allowed to become an everyday feature of life in this country. And there's going to come a time when people are just, can't cope with it anymore.
Jeremy Dein, thank you for discussing these important issues with me. I'm sorry it's ending on such a bad note. It is worth saying, by the way, that I think the reason I feel so passionate about these things, and I'm sure the same must be true of you, is there's so much to defend and protect in our great nation
Yeah.
and tradition. That is why these things are ever pressing and more urgent issues to deal with. But the solutions are not at hand, right?
No, and I absolutely. And I just want to say as we end, like my dad was a waiter. My dad was given opportunities. His parents came from Eastern Europe. I know how amazing this country has been for the Jewish community, and the opportunities it's given people like you and I to rise up in our professions. I think part of the problem is that we're just so disappointed and so exasperated. We have a fundamental love of this country, but it's getting to the point where that is being overridden by desperation. That's the problem. And that desperation is real, and it's going to get worse. So yes, a negative note, but we have to face the reality.
Jeremy, thanks very much.